46. The farm building that's now home to the distillery isn't quite that old. It was built in 1830, but looked its age before the family decided enough was enough.
5 years ago, facing a main road had become a disgrace because the roof was falling in. It was difficult to see exactly what else we could do.
The steading is right next to the estate's golf course. Golf and whiskey just seem to go together naturally in Scotland, so why not build a distillery?
We are very lucky that actually the owner of the nearby in Rothes, which can only be about 20 miles away, the owner of the biggest copper and all the pipe work that's needed, actually plays on our golf course every Saturday. So the linkage was there and we were able to build on it.
And you didn't have to wait as long as everybody else that wants stills from Forsyths now, right?
I think it's fair to say that we probably squeezed into a busy schedule that Richard Forsyth had on at the time.
That was 5 years ago. Now, Ballindalloch Distillery is humming right along with a small staff of industry veterans running the place.
Gentlemen, how are you? Here for the visit?
Brian Robinson is the distillery's manager and host. He spent 8 years at Glen Livet and 2 years before that at the Glen Livet.
Okay, see you in a moment.
Big distilleries I've seen, I've worked in, and they have their own merits. But the opportunity to come and be part of a small family distillery such as this one was an opportunity I couldn't ever pass up. So for me, to be here now is very rewarding, and what I hope to do, my long-term goal, is to be stood in front of you in 25 years from now saying this is the Ballindalloch 25-year-old, and that would be a real honour to be able to do that.
Charlie Smith started his whiskey career 40 years ago at the old Pittywake distillery. He thought managing Talisker would be the final step on his journey.
And I retired from there in 2007 to relax, take it easy, and then this challenge came along as an opportunity which I couldn't turn down, to use all these years of experience to, well, not realise my dream perhaps, but allow someone else to realise theirs. And it's been a fantastic project to be part of, and still to be in the settling down phase. And I'll continue to do that until the end of this year, and then hopefully go back into retirement, improve my golf handicap, among other things.
It's amazing what you can do with an old barn, given enough money and the desire to do things right. How many barrels are you filling a week?
15 barrel equivalents. So 15 barrels, 12 hogsheads, or 7 sherry butts, depending on what we're filling on any given day. So the SRWV, Spirit Sealer Warehouse vessel, is currently about that full, and we will do another filling run tomorrow, and it's in here that the spirit gets pumped in, about an average of 67% alcohol by volume, and then before we fill into the cask, Charlie will come in, take the dip, calculate how much of our spring water we need to add to ensure that we get to the 63.5% filling strength that we use. So it's very practical, very simple. Again, we haven't over-engineered a solution, it's just a pump and a squeeze of a handle, and you fill a cask up. Why reinvent the wheel if you don't have to? And from there, obviously we need somewhere to keep the casks once they're full. So please, come and have a look at Warehouse 1. And this currently represents everything Ballindalloch Distillery has ever made.
This room once housed young livestock. Now it's home to young whiskey.
It's starting now to permeate through. That wonderful angel share aroma is just starting to come into play. This was actually dedicated to Forsyths when the distillery was under construction, so this was effectively their workshop. So it took a few weeks just for the smell of welding rods to disappear, but now it's starting to smell like a warehouse should. It's beautiful and cool in here. Even on the hottest day in summer, I can't imagine the temperature is going to raise particularly much, so that's giving us the ideal conditions for maturation. So when you're tired of the heat and the noise in the distillery, you can just walk a few steps and you've got the beautiful silence and the cool of the warehouse. And I think if you look, we've still used wooden beams in here, we've used wooden posts, Everything we've done with as much tradition in mind as we could possibly muster.
And that means waiting until the whiskey is ready before bottling it. No new make, no young spirit. It'll be at least 8 to 10 years before a bottle of Ballindalloch single malt hits the market. But when the land's been in the same family for 469 years, what's another decade or so?
Hello and welcome to Whisky.com, where fine spirits meet. And today I'm at an icon of this single malt Scotch whisky industry. It's the Glenfarclas Distillery. Glenfarclas is located here in the Speyside, and Glenfarclas means Valley of the Green Grass. So if you look around, it's already fall, so the bushes and the trees are turning yellow and brown, but still the grass is really, really green. And so, yeah, it is truly the Valley of the Green Grass. So at the back, you see the hills of the Ben Rinnes. You can actually not see the peak from here, but it's the hillside of the Ben Rinnes. And that's where the distillery gets their water from. There's a creek flowing down, and that supplies the distillery with fresh water. Let's talk a bit about the history of the Glenfarclas Distillery. It was founded in 1836, and by founded, I mean registered. So they got registered in 1836, they got a legal distilling license, but they were distilling way before that, illegally. And that means we really don't know when Mr. Hay founded the distillery and when they started the distilling business. What was really, really important was that John Grant bought the distillery. The Grant family is now in the 6th generation of the distillery. So it's really a family business, and it's a generational family business. And these people really think about a few generations ahead. They produce whiskey that they never gonna taste because they produce it for their sons and grandsons or daughters, for that sake. So John bought the distillery. And then in the 1950s, the fourth generation, George S. Grant, he was very, very important for the distillery and even the whiskey industry, because the whiskey industry back in the time, if you know that, was dominated by blends. So the big names within the industry were blend whiskies, and they always bought their malt whiskey from distilleries like Glenfarclas. They bought casks and then mixed them together to get the blend that they wanted. But as some styles are a bit similar and taste profiles varied a bit, so these distilleries could be interchanged very easily. And that means that the price competition was very high for these distilleries. So they were barely making any money, they were barely getting by. And so George thought, why don't we sell the whiskey as a single malt whiskey? The whiskey is much better as a single malt anyway. We don't need that grain part. So he marketed Glenfarclas as a single malt whiskey, didn't sell that many casks to the blend industry anymore. And many people laughed at him and thought, that will never work. He will get bankrupt within a decade. But he persisted, he did it, and it actually worked. So he got much, much better margins for the new single malt whiskey. And Glenfarclas was actually a name to be recognized within the industry. And what that actually means for us today is he didn't have to give out that many casks, and it wasn't sold as cheap liquor and just wasted, but the casks still remain a few in the warehouses. So Glenfarclas really has a good amount of old casks within their warehouses, and you can see that in, let's say, the family cask series, where there are really, really old casks that can be filled as single cask bottlings. So that was the fourth generation that unfortunately already passed away. Now we are within the fifth generation with John, and then the sixth generation with George again. And they actually do lead the distillery, and they manage it really, really well. As they are a family business, as I mentioned before, they think ahead. They're not influenced that much by the fluctuation within the whiskey market, where whiskey is now in a boom cycle and maybe it goes into a bit of a recession in the future. So they keep persisting, and they think ahead in decades, not in just month or quarter of a year or something like that. So yeah, it's a really nice family business. Let's see how the Glenfarclas whiskey is made. The good whiskey production always starts with two ingredients, water and malt. Water we've already talked about, but now let's talk about the malt. The malt is delivered here by truck, so it's being malted somewhere else, and it is 100% barley. And then we have to actually filter the malt, because sometimes there can be some stuff inside the malt that you don't want. This is done by the malt dresser. It's a tumble, and you have the centrifugal effect, and that sorts out any lighter materials, any straws, any small branches or anything like that is being taken out of the pure malt. But still, there is some stuff left inside the malt, the heavier materials. This here is the destoner. It sorts out any stones. But before that, you see here is a conveyor belt, and it has a plate actually bolted onto it. And on that plate is a strong magnet, and that takes any magnetic metal parts out of the malt. After that, it goes into the destoner. And the destoner is basically a very jumpy thing that that lets the malt jump. All the lighter malt goes to the front and the heavier stones go to the back. And here you can see what they get out of the destoner. You really don't want to have these stones inside your malt mill. The malt mill is then a roller mill installed in the 70s, and they make a really coarse grist. And you can see that here. You have some flour in there, really grind down starch. Then you have the grits, like little bits of starch that stick together. And then you have the husks, the outside part of the malt. And when you've done a coarse grist, the malt is ready for the next production step. Behind me is the enormous mash tun of Glenfarclas. It has a capacity of 16,000 kilograms of grist, and it is mixed with water and then filled in here. You can see it steaming out. And in the mash tun, the water dilutes the sugar and the starches, and then you end up with a very, very sugary and sweet, starchy substance that's called the mash. And the mash is the stuff that is the base for the fermentation. You have a semi-lauter tun, so you have two kind of washings. The first washing and the second washing produce a sheer amount of 83,000 liters of mash, of this sugary substance that then goes to the fermentation. There is a third mashing going on, which produces a very lightly sweet sugary substance, which can't be used for the fermentation. So it's stored in a separate tank, and then this water is used in the next cycle, because you still don't want to lose any sugar and any starches. Even though they have such an enormous mash tun, they do something special with it, because they do it a bit slower than usual. Each mashing takes an enormous time of 11 hours, which is very long for an industry standard. And after we are off with this very sugary substance, we see how that stuff goes into the alcoholic fermentation. The mash tun is really, really big, so therefore the distillery has to split one mash tun into two wash bags. They actually have 12 wash bags, and they are being filled simultaneously. After they filled them to quite a level, they stop and then they add the yeast. So one is being filled, the other one gets the yeast, then this one stops and the other one gets the yeast. The yeast has to be added really precisely. If you have not enough yeast, then the fermentation is not fast enough, strong enough, then you will not end up with a good wash. If you add too much yeast, the yeast goes really fast, gets really hot, dies, you don't get a good yeast. So the amount of yeast they have to add here, you have to be really, really precise. The other thing that they can change the flavor profile of the wash is by controlling the speed of the fermentation and the duration. So the duration with 72 hours is actually really, really long. And that means that they have a very fruity flavor. The fruity characters come in the late stages of the fermentation, where you already have all the alcoholic fermentation, but you get more of a fruity character. So in the end, you don't get any more value as in more alcohol, but you do get more value as in flavor. The other thing is the speed of the fermentation. That is really not solely, but mainly defined by the temperature of the wash. And the temperature of the wash has two factors: the outside temperature and the initial temperature. The outside temperature is defined by the weather, and the weather here in Scotland can be very cold in winter and very hot in the summer, and mildly hot in the summer. And so in the winter, they actually have the mash that comes from the mash tun a bit warmer than they have it in the winter, in the summer. So the mash tun heats it up to 70, 80, 90 degrees Celsius. And then they cool it down. And they are now in fall, they're at about 19.5 degrees Celsius, what they use as their filling initial temperature. So the warmer is outside, the cooler they fill it into the fermentation tank. And that's how they get the consistency of the flavor profile all over the year. After they have fermented the mash, they end up with a wash that it has about 9% alcohol, depending a bit on the natural product that was used. So after they have this 9%, it goes off to the distillation. So I'm in the center, the heart piece of the distillery. It's the stills room. And right next to me is one of the 6 pot stills. It's one of the 3 wash stills that Glenfarclas has. It has a capacity of 26,500 liters and therefore is the biggest stills in the Speyside. And what is very, very special about Glenfarclas is they are very traditional. They have direct firing. Means there is a gas burner below the wash still, and that heats up the kettle. And that also means that when you have bits within the wash from the mashing, then you could actually have them fall to the floor, and the floor is very, very hot. It's really, really hot in here, and it could actually burn. So there is an old method that prevents that. You have a shaft that is propelling a propeller inside, and on the arms of these propellers there are chains, actually copper chains. And these chains are being turned around in the still clockwise. And that prevents anything from sticking to the bottom. And also it's mixing the whole mash and the whole boiling kettle a lot. So that prevents it from burning, and if you'd have burning, you'd have some unwanted flavors, and you don't want that. So we have the biggest pot stills in the market, and we have the humongous with direct firing. Now let's have a look at the second distillation. The second distillation is in the smaller spirit still. A spirit still is very important for the flavor of the whiskey. The spirit still shape is defining how the whiskey, how the alcoholic fumes are separated, and therefore very much defining the character of the spirit. Here we do have a very, very big reflux bowl. The reflux bowl is actually making reflux. So vortexes and everything that's twisting and turning in there with the alcoholic fumes. And that means the alcohol doesn't just rise to the top and immediately get condensed, so they can separate much better, which gives you a finer spirit and a bit lighter, a bit more floral, a bit more fruity. And the second part of the reflux bowl is the increased surface area. The alcoholic fumes stick to the copper plating on the walls of the kettle, and they have catalytic reactions going on with the copper, and that's the reason why we use copper, because of these catalytic reactions. With the increased surface area of the reflux bowl, we have more of these catalytic reactions, therefore also a finer and more gentle spirit that comes out of the spirit still. So if you define the character of the Glenfarclas distillery, of their raw spirit, then it's really a nice, gentle, Speyside malt whiskey. Behind me is the filling store of Glenfarclas. It's a very, very traditional filling store. You can see the big tank that is being filled with a new make spirit, and then the casks are being filled automatically up to the very, very top. But they don't even put a barcode on it. So what they do is they have stencils and then they have paint. So they paint everything on the casks. They are pre-painted with a number and year and John and George Grant, Glenfarclas Ballinderloch. But what they actually have to write on that cask as well is the amount that they fill into the cask. So the machine counts how many liters go into the cask, and then they have a separate stencil they use to roll on the exact amount that is filled into the casks. A lot of the flavor profile of a Glenfarclas whiskey comes from the maturation. And here the Glenfarclas maturation is pretty atypical. You have 38 warehouses, they're all dunnage, and they barely have any bourbon casks in there. And that's because the Glenfarclas core range is not made with bourbon casks. So they all use Oloroso sherry casks. When you look down there, you see a lot of sherry butts, but there are also smaller casks there. And that means that they use hogsheads. Hogsheads are casks that are disassembled and then reassembled again, which give you a bit of a 250-liter casks. 60% of the core range is matured in first and second fill, and the rest is then in third and fourth fill. And